Welcome to the Monstrous Flesh podcast, where we explore the evolution and role of women in horror, as well as familiar tropes of the genre, through a feminist lens. There will be spoilers in this episode, so if you haven't seen the film yet and don't want us to ruin it for you, pause this podcast and come back when you're ready for a deep dive into it. I'm Meg, one of your podcast hosts.
Hi, I'm Clelia, the other host of the podcast.
And in this series, we are turning our attention to the representation of female monsters in horror cinema. And in each episode, we dissect one film we feel fits the bill particularly well. And today our film is Evil Dead Rise. So, do you want to give us a synopsis, Clelia?
Let's do it. Evil Dead Rise is the latest installment in the Evil Dead franchise, and it tells the tale of two nearly estranged sisters whose reunion is cut short by the rise of flesh-possessing demons, thrusting them into a primal battle for survival as they face the most nightmarish version of long-lost family that you can possibly imagine. So, Meg, are you a fan of the Evil Dead franchise?
Right. Full disclosure. I've never seen the originals.
Not me putting you on the spot right here, right now.
I never saw the originals, but I saw the 2013 version when it came out. And
was that your entry point into the Evil Dead franchise?
Yes,
was that the first one you've seen?
The first one I saw, yeah. Right. So I rewatched that before this one. And I just, because I remember it really, really petrifying me first time I watched it. Mm-hmm. But then this time, what I realised is it's not, I mean, I think it's really good and I really like it, but it's the amount of jump scares I can't stand. Like, for a horror fan, I'm terrible. I'm just terrible at jump scares. So it takes me out of it. By end, I would just like watching through my fingers, like, oh God, not another one. And I think that the Evil Dead Rise were much easier for me to enjoy because it weren't constant, like somebody's popping up at, at a shower.
That's really funny. That's actually someone I know made the same comment. Actually, I mean, on the other way around, actually, they said that they didn't enjoy this one as much because it didn't have as many jump scare. Yeah. And it was weird to me to hear that because I was like, but just because I watched the original and I was like, and I don't really associate the Evil Dead franchise with any jump scares. So when she said that, I was like, I don't really get it. But then I watched the 2013 remake and I was like, oh, okay, yeah. No, I understand where you're coming from. So it's really interesting that the remake was your entry point into the franchise. Personally, I felt a bit apprehensive about doing an episode on this film, on the franchise rather than this film, because Evil Dead Rise is a thing in itself. But because I think this franchise is so important to so many people, and everybody has a story about how they came across it and which film started their journey with it, which tattoo they have of the cabin in the wood or Bruce Campbell or whatnot. You know what I mean? And I'm all here for it. Don't get me wrong. I love it, and it means a lot to me as well. But also, and I hope people won't bite my head off for saying this, but I think for me, it's also an example of the Film Bros universe. Do you know what I mean when I say this? People are obsessed with every little details of the production of these films. Some men feel represented by the character of Ash, who starts as a cowardly loser, then progressively becomes this badass hero, killing machine with zany one-liners and gets the ladies. So, and I've actually, as part of the prep, I suppose, for this episode, I watched the documentary Hail to the Deadites or Hail the Deadites on Amazon Prime, which is, anyway, It's not great, but it's also I felt like he did. I kind of feel like he didn't give a very good overview of Evil Dead fans. Sorry to say that to people who love it, but that was kind of my apprehension in talking about the franchise. And saying this, I mean, I absolutely love the film. I saw Evil Dead 2 was my entry point into the franchise, like many people, because obviously the original Evil Dead was part of the Video Nasties, so it wasn't available in the UK for a really long time. But yeah, and this one is really quite different though. So yeah, I think we can.
I feel from what I know about it that the originals have got a bit more of a comedy horror slant, whereas I feel the 2013 one is just relentlessly bleak. From beginning to end.
Yeah. It is so different. I mean, Evil Dead 2 is definitely a horror comedy. I would say the original Evil Dead. The original Evil Dead is, yes, there is comedy element to it, but the humor is more incidental, I would say, rather than, and it's so low budget, but it's absolutely great. I absolutely love it.
I'll have to watch it. I will have to watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, do treat yourself, even though it's completely different. I mean, I always say that I think the Evil Dead franchise is probably the most inconsistent franchise out there, because every film is absolutely so different. So it's always a treat. But let's
talk about Evil Dead Rise. You're right. We get it. This is what we do. Tangent City.
Well, yeah, and we could make a whole episode. We could make a whole episode about talking about the Evil Dead franchise. But we're here to talk about Evil Dead Rise. So let's deep dive into it. So this film is written and directed by Irish filmmaker Lee Cronin, who weirdly enough we mentioned in the last episode of the podcast because we were recommending his first film, The Hole in the Ground, from 2019. And I found out that The Hole in the Ground is actually where the Evil Dead Rise journey sort of began, because the film premiered at Sundance in 2019, and whilst Lee Cronin was there, Sam Raimi had seen the film at a press screening in LA at the same time, and before Lee left, Sam Raimi had reached out to him to talk, and in that meeting, Lee Cronin told him that he was that Evil Dead was a huge influence on his own work, and that's what kickstarted the whole thing. So this film has been in the works since 2019, effectively.
Wow.
Which is quite amazing, really.
Yeah, well, he's been popping up on my For You Twitter page, and so I've seen loads of videos of like the production, which I think is really nice to see, sort of lifting the veil a bit on the hidden world of how you make a film that is so. I mean, obviously we know I love a practical effect, so I liked it.
We're there for it. Yeah.
And I think what I've been so impressed by is there's all these little clips of actors like on bungee cords and rolling about on mats and practicing the stunts, and I think that's so cool that it is so real what you're watching. Obviously they're not really like stabbing each other in eyes and stuff, but they make it as real as possible. Definitely, and I think that comes through, and I think that's what's so different to films that are so predominantly like CGI, or it comes across and it feels when you watch it more exciting because it feels more realistic, and I also really would commend anybody who is willing to get like chucked out in a lift on a bungee wire and then slammed back in. Commitment to the craft.
Commitment to the craft, exactly. I heard a quote from the director actually saying that the great thing about the Evil Dead film is that they are entertaining terror, and that really resonated with me, because I realized today I'm quite a hypocrite when it comes to violence in horror films, because I'm always like, I'm not really one for super gory film, or rather I don't mind the gore, but if it's accompanied with humor or distancing framework. So Evil Dead is perfect for me, but I watched The Sadness this morning. I don't know why I did this to myself, to be honest. I had a couple of hours to spare this morning, and I was kind of like, I've been meaning to watch this film for ages, and oh my God. I mean, that's a whole different episode right here, but it was there and then end, I was kind of like, you know what? Like, I'm going to stick to the Evil Dead universe and, you know, the child's play and, you know, and all the stuff that I love when it comes to gore. But like, this was just, this was too much for me.
I also
honestly,
saw The
take it.
Sadness and were like, I don't think I could ever watch this again. Like, I think, you know, good and, you know.
Oh, absolutely amazing.
But see, my thing is, like, I always say I don't like realistic violence. That's not to say that I can't, because obviously I loved Evil Dead Rise and that's violent, but I hate the sort of, like, you know, that sort of torture porn that started with Hostel. I don't count French Extremity in that, you will notice. Call me a snob,
of course,
if you will. But I don't like that hyper-real violence that, you know, particularly because a lot of it is like directed against women's bodies as well, which I find quite difficult. So I like gore over the top, you know, like chainsaws and all that stuff.
Over the top is great
because it's so over the top that you can have that disconnect between this is not real. Whereas I think when stuff's meant to be like hyper realistic, I'm like, too empathic. We're too empathic, Clelia. That's what it is. Too much empathy.
That's exactly our problem. Anyway, to circle back to Evil Dead Rise and to the filmmaker a little bit, I think it's kind of an incredible thing, really, to go from his first feature to this. And I think he shows two things, really. That first of all, the strength of Lee Cronin as a writer-director, and to be able to attract that much attention from Hollywood, from Sam Raimi, with the film coming out of Ireland. But it also shows how Sam Raimi is a great supporter of talent. We know he did the same thing with Fede Alvarez, who directed the 2013 remake of Evil Dead. And at the time, he only had a couple of shorts. He'd only made a couple of short films. So Sam Raimi clearly saw his potential and let him run with it, which is always an amazing thing to see. Next time, though, the only thing I would say, my only note for you, Sammy, would be that we'd like to see a woman direct an Evil Dead film.
Let's see what a woman does with the Deadites.
Exactly.
Yes.
I'd love to see that. But, I mean, really, I think we can't complain with what Lee Cronin has conjured up with this new iteration of the story. It's fresh, it's rife with rich subtext about dysfunctional family, ideas about motherhood, and I don't know what you make of it, but I think extremely well-written female characters, actually.
Yes. I would agree.
Do we agree with that?
I would agree. I think, I mean, as always, I've forgot the names because that's my thing.
Beth and Ellie.
Beth and Ellie.
Two sisters.
Beth, yes. Yeah. There we are. Thank you. Terrible prep.
So I made a note as well because I was like, I'm definitely going to forget their names. So
I went down a massive rabbit hole for Folklore Corner, but forgot to even look up the names. So that shows really my, where my mind is, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's such an interesting dynamic between them as sisters, and this idea that Ellie has been gone, she's disappeared, she doesn't know what's happening in her sister's life, and then plops back in, and she's fun aunt. She's very much positioned as the fun aunt who drops in and drops out, and obviously they as a family have been going through a really serious upheaval with the fact that you know, dad's disappeared, and I think that tension between them is played really well, because sometimes what you find, and I know horror is a genre of extremes, but it's either one extreme or other. Like either the sisters who can't stand each other, or, you know, it's a perfect sort of dynamic that's somehow disrupted, and theirs feels very realistic. There's tension, but there's a lot of love. And, you know, they can't stand to be together, but they don't like to be apart. You know, I think it's a very realistic dynamic.
It feels authentic, Yeah, I agree. Definitely, and again, you showed that strength of, you know, the screen, Lee Cronin as a screenwriter here. I think he and that was very much shown as well. I think in The Hole in the Ground, his previous film, that he just knows how to flesh out those characters, and you know, obviously with Evil Dead, you know, there's usually with those films, there's not a lot of time spent on getting to know the characters. And, you know, in this one, you know, it gives a little bit more room for this, but I think, you know, that gives us, you know, a lot more license to care about those characters as well. To know where, you know, what they're going through, where they're coming from, and what's at stake for them. So I just find that, really, really great.
Absolutely,
a really great update on the story.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting. One of the things I was thinking about, because obviously I'd watched 2013 Monde just before, is how it picks up it's, you know, very much about motherhood, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that, but it picks up that thread of like traumatic mothers, because, you know, in the first one you've got a brother and sister whose mum weren't brilliant. I think, you know, maybe not through every fault of her own, but weren't a very, you know, supportive parent. And then in this you see sort of Beth and Ellie talking about the fact that their mum wasn't, and then you've got Beth, who is a very supportive parent, very engaged with her children, but letting them sort of have their autonomy, very supportive of them living the truth, you know, like being a very loving parent. And I think that's such an interesting continuation of a story about like intergenerational trauma and how you be the one who breaks the cycle, you know. But then obviously she don't, because she becomes the ultimate demon mother sort of thing. But
yeah,
you know, so I think that's an interesting angle to it, actually.
Which seems so unfair, doesn't it? That's the thing about the Evil Dead
Yeah.
films. I feel like it's because there's no, you know, once you get possessed, basically, there's no going back from that. So, you know, Ellie gets possessed early on in the film, and, you know, what's at stake is for the other characters to survive.
Have I mixed the names up? Which one's Beth? Is Beth the younger sister?
Yeah, Beth is the younger sister, and Ellie is the one who gets possessed.
Everybody ignore what I said. I meant, you know what I mean. You know what I meant.
But I mean, like we said, they you know, they're both dealing with their fair share of trauma, even before the deadites show up. Beth finds out she's pregnant at the beginning of the film, and this is the driving factor for her to visit her sister and her kids. And like you said, it soon become obvious that Beth has been MIA for a while, because she had no idea that her sister is separating from her husband or partner, I'm not sure, and the kids are getting kicked out of their apartment. Oh, by the way, quick side note here, the building where they live, which is later revealed to have been a bank at some point, I think, is called Monde, which is an anagram of demon. Not a very good anagram, may I note. But that's sorry, I'm being a complete nerd here, but I've made a little list of, because obviously the film is full of, you know, Easter eggs and references to the rest of the franchise, also to other horror films. So I wonder if you would humour me for a minute and let me go through my little list of of things that I noticed that I was desperate to talk to someone about. Because I saw it with my partner, and I was kind of like at the end listing all these things, and he was like, I don't care. How dare he, honestly. Last time I go to the cinema with him. So starting from the very opening shot of the film, which is pretty much identical to that of the original Evil Dead, you know, the traveling POV shot that has, of course, since then become iconic and synonym with the franchise, is the opening shot in this film. The wooden cabin with then being shown is quite a bit different from the original one. And in fact, I might be making this up in my mind, but I think it's very reminiscent of the hut in Midsummer.
Yeah.
Might just be me. I haven't seen anybody else noting this, so it might just be my mind. However, once in the cabin, you can spot a clock on the wall of the cabin that is an exact replica of the one in the original film. Major nerd fact here. The first character to be possessed in the film recites a passage from Wuthering Heights without looking at the book her friend is holding, which of course is reminiscent to the scene in the original film where Cheryl correctly guesses a series of cards without being able to see them. The iconic eyeball spit scene from Evil Dead 2 is reprised in this film. It's, of course, a lot more gruesome. The eye is bitten out of a character's face and spit into the mouth of another. And by the way, the sound effect of the eyeball bitten out in Evil Dead Rise was achieved by Bruce Campbell biting into an apple, which I loved finding about that. The elevator filled with blood is obviously a reference to The Shining, so not going to expand on that one. The boomstick and the chainsaw are obviously making an appearance in this film, and in terms of gallons of fake blood being used, I think this film easily takes on the 2013 blood rain scene. And finally, maybe my favorite, and I may have made that up in my mind because I want it to be true, but when Ellie is sitting outside the apartment, she tries to lure in Cassie by singing a haunting lullaby called Hushabye Baby, and I might be thinking a little too hard about this, but it could be a clever little reference slipped in there by the Irish director as a wink to the 1990 Irish film of the same name about a 15-year-old girl who accidentally becomes pregnant and has to deal with the harsh consequences of her predicament. But you know, if that's true, I think that's a really nice link to Beth and her predicament, and linking it to Lee Cronin and his heritage. So that's it. That's my
Wow.
nerd segment done.
Incredible. No, I love it. That's amazing. Well, yeah, with The Shining, I mean, I'm happy because that's the gift that I always send when I'm on my period.
Of course, what
Yeah,
else?
so I'm happy to have another edition to be like, watch out. But yeah, I think I read as well that they had to do that, so they had to practice with water because they only had one take because it was so many gallons and gallons of blood that they only had to do it. They had to do it once, which I think again, like, yes, you know, let's do it. It's like guerrilla. Well, it's not guerrilla filmmaking because obviously they had a big budget, but that bit feels particularly like we've got to do it now.
That's
you know?
a dream, I think, for a filmmaker. Exactly.
Yeah.
That, you know, that one shot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, shall we get into then Mummies with the Maggots now? Which is going to go down
Yes,
as an
please.
iconic line.
Iconic.
But, I mean, I really loved it. And I loved when she was like, oh, I'm finally free of you titty-sucking parasites. And, I found it's something I've been sort of thinking about for something else, actually. But this idea about like dualities of like disgust and devotion, and I think they're particularly common in possession films. And if you'd have asked me before Evil Dead Rise, I would have said I didn't like possession films, apart from obviously, the main one, The Exorcist, obviously.
Which one could you be talking about?
I know, why did I clarify? Like people weren't going to know. But I think looking at this, I actually do really like them. I think when there's this complexity to it, and because that's one of the things that I love about Exorcist is
Why?
oh, go on.
Why? Sorry, I was just going to say why would you have said before that possession films were not?
Well, I don't
your
know,
thing?
really. I think I just always thought they were a bit boring. I think because there were so many, it were like for a few years, only thing that ever came out were a possession film.
True.
And I think I'd maybe just thought, oh, it's not really my bag, which seems bizarre because, I'm a folklorist and stuff. But yeah, I just would have said, oh, let's watch something, is there something different? Is there something about like a big shark or, a creature feature of some kind?
Okay, more creature feature than, yeah. Well, that's for me. I'm like, that is my jam, definitely.
Yeah.
Possession. Give it to me.
But I thought like the body horror aspect, because obviously everybody knows that I love the body horror, but I think that sort of physical transformation that is experienced in a possession, I think is actually something I am interested in. So this is going to make me seek out more possession films, I think.
Excellent. Job done.
Yeah, but yeah, and also that idea about it's the mother, so they feel that devotion, like when youngest opens door and she's got her in and she's trying to like strangle her because it's her mum, even though she looks so changed, it's still her mum. So she there's still that sort of devotion there. And I think, and then when she sort of comes back and she says, don't let it take me baby, it's like it's this there's still that bond there until obviously Ellie is...
Yeah, I read, sorry, just about that scene you were just talking about when I think it is very poignant because it's something that's been, used time and time again in horror films, I think, that scene, with the character, let me in. And, most of the time you wouldn't forgive the character for letting them in. You'd be like, you stupid idiot. Like, obviously... Don't open the door, but there, because it's a child, and as you said, there is that bond, of mother and child. I think it's actually a very poignant moment, and at no point do you feel like, Cassie is being a complete idiot.
Yeah.
It's just she just wants to believe that her mum is back, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I think it's that like still wanting to do what she tells him to. Like she's asking me to let her in and she's my mum, I've got to do it. And I just think there's something really interesting in that dynamic that has not necessarily, all that I can think of, been done in that way before. And obviously there's the strain of like the single mother and the guilt of, kids that, obviously then, and I'm sorry, I can't remember any of the names. The one who reads the book. I can't.
I can't either.
Ash, no?
Cassie's the little one,
Yeah.
but I cannot remember the name of the other
can't
two.
remember.
Sorry guys.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, the one who reads the book.
Yeah. The naughty one.
The naughty one who reads the book. But that guilt then that they've brought that into their house, and the mum, and then obviously then the sister, and then the self is like sacrificed to it. But I was thinking about what you said earlier as well, because it seems to be quite unfair that through no fault of your own, you get sort of infected with this demon, and then that's it. Like, there's no hope. You're just dead. You're in hell, apparently.
Yeah.
Like, I can't think of any film that does that. I mean, even in Hellraiser. I mean, you can if you're not meant to be there, they don't take you. That's like the sort of thing. And it's such an interesting interplay between, I feel like, sort of folk horror with this idea about, ancient evil, and it's maybe tied to trees, and and it's tied to nature. But then this like very Christian idea about hell, and you're going to burn in hell and everything else. And it's this really interesting mix. And like, the Book of Human Skin, which just makes me think of Hocus Pocus.
Oh wow, I had not made that shortcut. That's brilliant.
But like it's just that, even that's a very sort of old idea, isn't it? Like, they used to bind books in skins of hanged men and all that stuff, and it's calling back to like a very old idea about sort of dark magic, I suppose. And I think it's really interesting how they do it. I mean, as well, I love that it's single location, because I love that. I think how they use building is fantastic in it. It's so clever.
No, it absolutely. That was going to be the next thing I wanted to talk about. Actually, was that big shift in scenery that this film brings to the table. We move from the cabin in the woods to the city, to a big tall apartment building. Obviously that's a really important and significant move, and I wasn't quite sure. The trailer was really well constructed in that way, because it made you think that it was happening in the woods. But it's it's really significant, especially considering, and I know you probably be talking a lot more about that in when you talk about the folklore aspect and elements of the film. But when we consider the symbolism of the forest and the cabin in the woods, the deep dark wood being used in both fairy tales and Gothic literature, simultaneously a magical realm and a place of danger. So, like, what do you think? How do you think it's worked to make that shift from the familiar cabin in the woods narrative to that apartment building? Have they managed to translate the same themes?
I think they have. I think they did
deeper into it.
I think they did it really well. I think to be able to get that same sense of you're trapped and you're isolated. Because obviously they're living in a building that's been condemned, so most people have already gone, and then
Exactly.
then it's how they use the sort of architecture, so stairs fall out and lift don't work, so they're trapped. And then obviously when Ellie's like going up in through air vents and everything, and they just use that space so well. And I think, is it slightly convenient that it's an old bank and there just happens to be this vault in there? Well, yes, it is, but suspend your disbelief, people.
Of course.
We're talking about a book made of skin.
Exactly. Exactly. Suspension of disbelief is important at this stage.
And I did think it were quite funny that they'd included the vinyl. That feels like, very contemporary to be like, we've got Necromicon on vinyl.
I know, that's very, very hipster.
Yeah, hipster demonic possession. But I did, again, I suppose we can look at that as a tie back to the sort of sins of the father, if you will, about religion, that these priests were dabbling in something that they shouldn't be dabbling in, and
Absolutely.
didn't heed the warnings, and then didn't destroy it, just decided to put it in a vault.
Why would you?
Didn't throw it into the sea, or make it so nobody could find it again. Just put it in a bank vault. But I think that's interesting as well. This idea that it's travelled through, through time, like it's endured through time. And I mean, I'd be quite interested to see maybe like an historical Evil Dead. Maybe like that priest, like going back to that and seeing,
Well, Meg, you need to watch Army of Darkness
all
then
right.
in that case.
In night or something. I've seen posters in like Camelot or something. Yeah. But yeah, like and I think they've left it like there's so many ways you could go that you could still be telling this story, and it is very, very rich in its own folklore. Like it's created its own mythology, which I always really appreciate. But yeah, I mean, I really loved it. And I know we've talked about the gore a little bit, but what did you think about like when she's got tattoo gun and she's like going for her eye and then...
Oh my God. You know what? I think probably the first thing that I've done is go home and look at my cheese grater and say, this is gonna change our relationship.
Yeah, well,
I think it was so creative.
Yeah.
It was so creative in terms of... I just love the idea of like, it makes you scared of all the, of all these objects that you have around you all the time and thinking, this is a weapon, this is a weapon, this is a weapon.
Well,
nothing is safe.
Yeah.
It's just...
And that's what it does so well because it does it in your own home then. It's not like, I'd never go to a stupid isolated cabin in woods. It's like, oh God, my own kitchen. And I saw that...
exactly, that's...
Yeah, well, I just saw when it premiered that they were giving everybody like little mini cheese graters. And I thought that was so cool as like a promo. That's so fun.
That's fantastic. That makes a really great point actually about that. So that, that shift in scenery obviously is very important to the franchise, but actually, like you said, it's very effective that he puts it in a domestic setting. And, obviously considering it was, I believe that the film was written during COVID as well. And I think that's kind of reflected in that idea of being isolated with your family. But the architecture of the building, as I said, it's dilapidated and it's half empty, and the apartment building. So it would make sense that that all of a sudden no one is aware of of their predicament basically. But in terms, even in if we think of it in terms of psychological analysis, that idea of levels, and the book is found in the basement. I mean, just like in the cabin is that idea of the basement where our subconscious live and where our fears and desires live, and and take that out of of that subconscious level and bring it into the familial surrounding, and then that's when shit hits the fan basically. And I just think it's a very to bring that in an environment that's already dysfunctional and partly fragmented, and to see what happens. It's just I just think it's a fantastic update on the narrative.
Absolutely, and then their apartment being like this lovely, warm, very individual, very sort of bohemian space in this very rundown, spooky looking building, but it's like their little safety like cocoon really, and then it's violated by something coming in that is uninvited. And I think that's a really interesting part as well, and that I suppose is much more relatable to people in that setting than it is in a cabin in woods where you'd go for a weekend. I think to introduce that horror to your living space and your sort of family home where you're meant to feel safest is a really interesting interpretation of that story. And like the call back to when she's sort of strung up in lift to Mia when she gets strung up in forest, and it's there's a lot to sort of connect the dots, but I think what this has done with it is just really breathe like new life into it, which is ironic to use that sort of phrase. But I mean, Mummy's with the Maggots now is going to go down in quoting history.
Absolutely fantastic line.
Yeah.
I think in terms of other themes that the film deals with, and there's been quite a lot of great films lately that have been dealing with similar themes. Is that idea of reluctant motherhood, right? Beth, who finds out she's pregnant and is conflicted about that idea, and in the end kind of becomes mothers to those to those kids, because Mummy's with the Maggots now. And I don't know if you have any. I'm sure you have many thoughts about this, but I just thought again it's beautifully horrifically beautifully portrayed in this film, and it's really great to finally see lots more films dealing with that, with that theme, playing with it, and not necessarily giving a a resolution to it. And I really love that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting about reluctant motherhood as well, because obviously you get the vibe that it's not necessarily Ellie that's speaking, but when she says, "I'm finally free, are you parasites?" there might be an element of truth to that in the wake of this breakdown we're in a relationship, that she's thinking, shit, I'm stuck here with these 3 kids in this rundown flat, and I've got no money, and they're my responsibility now because the dad gets to walk away and I don't get to walk away. And so I think there's like a duality to that in terms of ambivalent motherhood, because I think Beth is obviously, she don't know what to do. She's found out she's pregnant. She's not in a place in her life to do it. But then Ellie's much further down that line, and I think that is such an interesting point to explore in terms of ambivalency in motherhood. Is like when it's too late, basically. They're here,
Yeah, no, exactly. You're right. Ambivalent is definitely a better term for it. Yeah. It's but yeah, I think it's fantastic to see it explore more and more in horror. And I think in that one, that was probably one of the themes that when I walking out of the cinema, I was kind of like, this is so different for an Evil Dead film to feel so profound, actually. For me, people might disagree, but
and I think as well, like obviously at the end when there's some sort of horrible, like mashed up, many-limbed monster, it's a bit of a stretch to talk about enmeshment in that term. They're not necessarily enmeshed, but literally enmeshed. But I think that as well is like, it's such a perversion of the family unit, literally the reunit,
100%,
just moving together, and I was like, oh God, this is awful. But then you feel really bad because, like when she obviously then the fantastic ending, again with the blood rain, when that callback to that, but when she like shoves her into a chipper. And I think
wood chipper, exactly. I mean, there's imagine having to do that to your own sister.
Not enough wood chippers, if you want my opinion. I think need more wood chipper.
I agree.
But yeah, I think even though you can say to yourself, you're not my sister and me niece, you're not me family anymore, but you're still looking at the face of your family as you're sort of shunting them into a wood chipper. And I think, that's a horror that is not explored as much in this, because I don't think that's the purpose of it. I think it is meant to be a very entertaining gore fest that's got these messages. But I think that'd be such an interesting area as well to think about, like which I think things like The Exorcist again does it, but there's an happy ending. Whereas in this, there's no happy ending. So she gets out and she goes running off with a surviving niece and everybody else is dead. It's really great.
Exactly. And God knows how long they will survive as well, because the evil is unleashed, and then there's no way to put it back in the box, and so it's dead by dawn, or if you survive it, then that night will come again for sure. So,
absolutely. But I mean, I did think it were a very good ending, even though it's pretty depressing to think that dead is dead or whatever, like that's. But I
loved it. I left with a big grin. I was kind of like, oh, it circles back perfectly. Yeah. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, are we ready for Folklore Corner, Clelia?
Please, I am so ready for it. And I cannot wait to hear everything you have to say.
I did too deep a dive, as always.
No such thing.
But I've thought about it in terms of spirit possession, which seems to be a bit more of an encompassing term than like demonic possession, because obviously demons aren't necessarily prevalent globally. But this idea about being possessed is prevalent in many cultures and religions. And one definition that we can use is that spirit possession is the belief in external forces that can be malevolent or benevolent, taking over a body or an object. I think that's a definition that we can all relate to, this idea that, some external entity takes over someone's body, which is what we see in Evil Dead Rise. But due to the variance in it across the globe, an incredible person I found out about, although I do need to do more reading on him, Erica Bourguignon, who is an anthropologist considered the premier authority on trance, possession and altered states of consciousness. So I've just found my new dream job. basically.
Absolutely love that, yeah.
Erica Bourguignon did a lot of work looking at sort of spirit possession and trance states across the globe in a lot of different cultures. And so she suggested that when we are trying to look across different cultures and different countries, that we should see spirit possession as a means of interpretation. So it's not like a particular set of symptoms like swallowing glass or, breaking your back and then snapping back upright or anything like that. It should be seen as like a diagnostic model through which cultures interpret certain phenomena, which I thought were really interesting. And different cultures have different attitudes. So in some cultures, for instance, like shamans, mediums and oracles can be possessed, and this is desirable because then they act as vessels for benevolent gods and spirits, and it means they can heal the sick and deliver prophecies and things like that. But in others, which we are much more used to seeing in cinema, it's not a desirable outcome, because unwelcome and malevolent or demonic forces can take hold. So it's not possible, and this is not a cop-out on my end, it's not possible to categorise all forms of possession. So Erica Bourguignon found in a 5-year period from 1963 to 1968 that in 488 countries that she surveyed, there were more than 375 different traditions of spirit possession, with some form of possession appearing in 77% of the countries she explored, which I thought was quite interesting.
Wow.
Yes. So would you like a timeline of the history of possession?
Oh, please. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. That's absolutely amazing stuff. I was trying to think if there was an example of a film with a positive example of possession, or at least to begin with.
Ghost, with Patrick
and I'm not
Swayze.
Quite sure.
And Whoopi Goldberg. I just thought of that off the top of my head.
That sounds great. I was wondering if... Oh my god, that's brilliant! I love that. I was wondering if have you seen the trailer for the new A24 film with the? I don't want to say talk to the hand. I'm sure it's not called that, but it's like the one with the hand.
Yeah.
And she grabs the hand and she got portal
that looks really good. Yeah,
but I think it seems like it becomes like a it starts as a experience and then it turns bad. But yeah, apart from that, Ghost is on next protocol.
But when I say a timeline, obviously I've not gone from the start of history all the way through. What I've done is sort of found some of the earliest examples, and then I've picked some examples that I think speak to what we talk about on this podcast, which is the ways that like gender and class are really negatively affected by ideas about possession, particularly obviously women, which is what we talk about. So from 1600 to 1050 BCE, oracle bones from the Shang dynasty reveal that there was a belief that various maladies were caused by spirits or demons. So that gives an idea about how long the records go back in terms of belief in spirit possession. In 357 CE, the life of Anthony was compiled, and this talks about the spiritual struggles of Saint Anthony, and this has had a lasting influence on how Christianity interprets demonic forces. So when we see films that are about, demonic possession through a Christian lens, like The Exorcist and things like that, we can trace it back to 357 CE, or at least in part. In 645 CE, the Japanese government outlawed mediumship in an attempt to assert control, which eventually led to the temporary exile of the traditionally female mediums, who were known as Miko, which, no surprise there, the women get the short end of the stick.
No surprise.
In 1374, there was the first outbreak of dancing mania in Germany, which is a fascinating phenomenon.
Yes, I've heard about that one. It's absolutely amazing.
Yes, and there were numerous people reported uncontrollable dancing for days. This was followed then by an outbreak in Strasbourg in 1518, where 400 people are reported to have died from exhaustion. Goodness me.
Completely mad, that one, yeah.
It's absolutely fascinating. From 1500 to the 1800s, we have the transatlantic slave trade, where approximately 12 million enslaved people were trafficked to North and South America, and they brought a lot of their beliefs, which were then changed through contact with European and indigenous peoples. And this led to what has been termed the Afro-Atlantic traditions, which that's not my terminology, but that's which include voodoo, Santeria, and Umbanda. You'd be interested to know that from 1600 to 1700, it was known as the golden age of the It was known as the golden age of the demoniac. in Europe.
What a time to live in.
What a time to be alive. And so, but again, this idea about power and class comes into this, because this was when the sort of separation, Catholic and Protestant churches. And so there were all these reports about possession and churches' attempts to combat it. And so these exorcisms played into this sort of religious power play, because they demonstrated the strength of the church, but only if they weren't seen as superstitious, which I find bizarre. Sky Daddy's fine, superstition's bad. And it was also the first time that the term Dybbuk was recorded, which I'll talk about those shortly. But now we're really getting into it as we move through the 1600s. I promise the gap gets much wider between time periods. In 1614, the Ritual Romanum was written, and this established the first Catholic rite of exorcism, which we still see in a lot of these films. In 1634, we see another case of mass demonic possession in an Ursuline convent in France, which was followed by a further outbreak in 1647. I mean, why aren't people writing more films about, dance mania and demonic nuns? I feel like we need more films about this.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are the films that I want to see.
They're what I want to see. I want to see a film about dancing mania in demonic nuns. That's what I want. Combine the two.
Very quickly about the dance mania. I think so. One of my friends lives in Strasbourg, and I was telling her about this. She had no idea about it, but she said every year. So she soon started reading out about it, and she then found out that every year they have a rave to commemorate it.
That's cool. Well, we'll add that. Crazy? We'll add that to the Penis Festival in Japan. We'll do the Penis Festival, and then we'll go to the dance mania rave.
The Monstrous Flesh World Tour is on.
But yeah, so in 1692 to 93, we have the Salem witch trials. Obviously, everyone knows about them. In 1848, the Fox sisters began their, rat-a-tat-tapping and gave birth to the spiritualist movement. If you're not aware of the Fox sisters, a very interesting sort of trio to read up on. And now we're sort of getting into specific cases. So in 1895, Bridget Cleary was tortured and murdered by her family in Tipperary Island because they thought she was a changeling. So this is another element to possession, that the fairies, the fae, have taken you. 1922, Haxan's released, a personal favourite for me and Clelia. And then in 71, The Exorcist, the book, comes out, with a film in 73. A case that you might be familiar with, I teach this case when I'm teaching about occult crimes, is in 1976. Annalise Michel was murdered by her parents and Catholic priests. Somewhat controversially, I do use the term murdered because, she did die in a absolutely preventable way. So she died of malnutrition and exhaustion and pneumonia after she'd been subject to repeated exorcisms. Now, no charges were brought against those involved because, why would you? But the Catholic Church did convene to reevaluate practices. So after this, we sort of see a dying down of the old exorcism train. But in recent years, it has resurfaced, with apparently now they are training priests again in exorcism at the Vatican. Make of that what you will. Maybe we're in an end of days scenario. Maybe they know something we don't.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But the most recent example, and then I'll stop this timeline because I could talk about it all day, but I won't, is that in 2011 to 2012, 15 girls in Leroy, New York, experienced anomalous twitching and seizing, and this received national media attention. And it was later attributed to conversion disorder, which is where sort of mental ill health can have a physical impact on your brain function. Quite how that could occur to 15 girls simultaneously has never been explained. But I thought that were an interesting idea about sort of mass possession, thinking about, the nuns and the Salem witch trials, and this idea about these mass sort of events is very interesting. But just to finish, I did find out some of the different forms of possession from across the globe, if you would like to hear them, Clelia.
Please, I'm fascinated.
So as I feel I've gone too far into the demonic hole today. Well, I should rephrase that probably, but I won't.
Come back, Meg. You're too far in the demonic hole.
So Dybbuk, as I mentioned earlier, is part of Jewish mythology. And they're believed to be the wandering soul of a dead person that comes to possess living hosts, because Dybbuk is Yiddish for cling. which I thought was a very satisfying word.
Ah.
So what they are is debated. So some think that the family members whose souls are in limbo. Some think that they are people who have been kept out of the afterlife because of sinful acts such as suicide. Again, not my judgment. But an interesting sort of contemporary case of Dybbuk, well, dastardly Dybbuk's, I suppose, is that Post Malone is said to have been cursed when he touched a box that contained a trapped Dybbuk.
Oh, I wish people could see my face right now. This is perfect. I didn't know, like, but when this sentence started, I had no idea it would finish here. Wow.
So in Japan, the Misaki are small-scale spirits with big influences that can cause illness and death, and it's thought in some regions that people who die violent deaths become Misaki to wreak their revenge. The sort of last couple of examples relate specifically to women in a way that I think you'll appreciate, Clelia. So in Mozambique, there's a very relatively new phenomenon which occurred after the Civil War, which is where women are possessed by gamba who are said to be dead soldiers. And prior to this war, spirit possession were limited to certain families and it were less common. So the idea that it only affects women is quite common actually in quite a lot of different cultural contexts. But I thought that was interesting, as is the fact that in the 1980s, female workers in Malaysian factories were allegedly becoming possessed. And so they were becoming like screaming, becoming violent, destructive. And factory owners were regarding it as mass hysteria, and basically that it was this intrusion of archaic beliefs and, you know, loading these women up with Valium and sending them home, which seems to be the way that, you know, the man, as it were, the capitalist deals with things. But the anthropologist Ahiwa Ong noted that these beliefs were actually typically held by older married women, whereas these female factory workers were young and unmarried. So it wasn't necessarily that they were like influenced by these older beliefs.
Not linked.
But what I thought was particularly interesting is that she connects this phenomenon to the rapid industrialisation and modernisation of Malaysia. So she believes that spirit possession is a traditional way of rebelling against authority without punishment, and suggests that it were a means of protesting against their untenable working conditions. So possession is a feminist act. I think we can.
Yeah, I was going to
say
it's definitely, it's very, very gendered. Yeah. It's amazing that there are so many instances that are experienced by women more than men.
Yeah, absolutely.
That made me think, I don't know if you've listened to it, but Alice Slowe did a series on Audible called Hysteria.
Oh, yeah.
Which talks a lot of the case that you were talking about. She talks about in depth in those series. So really, like, if you haven't listened to it, it's absolutely amazing, and it really goes like deep into the demonic hole, and also deep into the psychology behind mass hysteria.
Oh yeah, that sounds brilliant.
So yeah, really, really recommend this one.
Well, that leads us neatly into our recommendations, I suppose, doesn't it? You've done it again. Damn you, Clelia, you've done it again.
Hey.
So,
right, do you want to take this one? Do you want me to start? Or,
I mean, I think I've probably mentioned most of mine already. I had
Go for it.
The Exorcist, obviously, the original Evil Dead. I also had The Babadook, which I think is a very interesting one that people don't always link to possession, but I think it's very much about possession. Yeah. And also the anthology XX, which has some really good.
Yes. Great.
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'll strike all these off my list then. Because we had a lot of crossover there. But I suppose I had Drag Me to Hell. Yes. By Sam Raimi as well. So fun one when it comes to possession. The Hole in the Ground, obviously, Lee Cronen's first feature. If you haven't seen it, run and see it. It's so worth it. A Nightmare on Elm Street, for some reason. I noted down. I was like, why not? Brilliant Indonesian horror film called May the Devil Take You from 2018.
I've been meaning to watch that. Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic, and really, I think, a good companion piece for Evil Dead Rise. And finally, one that I saw today, but if you're more on the side of Evil Dead being, spooky fun and a bit ridiculous, is Deadstream. That's just, that's, I think, it's been on Shudder for not too long. But yeah, as far as spiritual children of the Evil Dead franchise, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a greater contender than Deadstream, which picks up the supernatural slapstick gauntlet while still very, very much doing its own thing. So if you haven't seen it, I kind of recommend it for a bit of silly fun. But yeah, thank you so much. That was so amazing. I'm definitely gonna have to to steal your note, because there's so much stuff that you talked about on this episode that I was like, I need to read more about this. This is amazing. So thank you for your deep dive.
Oh no, well, I think what I found so interesting about it is that it's seen very much by anthropologists as possession as a culturally specific form of conflict management. So it disguises but also resolves social tensions. And so I think reason why it endures as it does, and why there's so many films about it, and why people still are performing exorcisms today, is that rather than it being this relic from the past, it's possession and exorcism aren't these surviving relics, but they're these frameworks by which modern people are making sense of the world and looking for meaning, and that's not changed over from 1600 BCE to now. That people are still using these frameworks, and I just think it's so interesting. And also, what an idiot I were to be like, I don't like possession. Rubbish.
that's all we'll be watching now. Welcome to the dark side.
Yeah. But one last recommendation is Husera the Bone Woman, which I watched to do a review for recently, and it is absolutely fantastic. And again, that like sort of possession as a narrative to talk about ambivalent motherhood, very, very good and very well done. And that's going to be on Shudder as well.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And I watched it after your recommendation and reading your review of it, and we need to talk after this episode. I'm so tempted to. We need to cover it. We need to do something about it, because I am obsessed with this film. It is so good. If you haven't seen it, guys, run to see it.
Thanks for listening to Monstrous Flesh. Please join us next time for more discussion about women in horror. You can find out more about us via our website, monstrousflesh.co.uk, where you can find out more about our research for each episode, buy our wonderful merch, and see our upcoming events. We'd also love to hear from you, either via our email or social media channels, and also please rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and help us spread our spooky word by telling your friends about Monstrous Flesh. Until next time, creep it weird, everyone!